In the freezing snowstorm, she lost everything. Can a mysterious man bring light to her heart? The winter of 1886 roared into the Dakota Territory with a ferocity that could break even the hardiest of spirits, its gales tearing through the frost-laden pines of silver pines like a pack of hungry wolves. Nestled at the edge of this fledgling frontier town, a small apothecary shop stood as a beacon of fragile hope. Its weathered sign, Ashwood's Remedies, swaying in the relentless wind, the painted letters chipped but defiant. Inside, Lillian Ashwood, a 31-year-old widow with a healer's hands, leaned over a scarred wooden counter, her nimble fingers grinding dried sage in a mortar, the faint scent of herbs mingling with the chill that seeped through the cracks in the walls. Her raven-black hair, streaked with a single strand of silver from grief too heavy for her years, was swept into a loose braid, framing a face that bore the quiet strength of survival. Her hazel eyes, sharp with determination, though exhaustion, dulled their once vibrant glow. Lillian's apothecary was more than a livelihood. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could bury the ghosts of a life that had shattered 3 years ago. Her husband, Daniel Ashwood, had been a doctor in Silver Pines, a man of boundless kindness whose laughter had once filled their small cabin with warmth. Together they'd run this shop, blending his medical knowledge with her knack for herbal remedies, tending to the townsfolk with poultices and tonics. But a diphtheria outbreak in the winter of 1883 had claimed him, and their unborn daughter with him, leaving Lillian to face the world alone. She'd pawned Daniel's medical books to pay for his burial, keeping only a single memento, a silver locket he'd given her on their first anniversary, a pressed violet nestled inside, its delicate petals a reminder of a spring that felt like a lifetime ago. Now that locket hung around her neck, a cold weight against her heart, as she poured her grief into her work, crafting remedies for others while her own wounds festered in silence. The shop was as cold as the Dakota tundra. Outside, the iron stove in the corner long since gone dark. Lillian had sold her last bundle of firewood to Mr. Amos Tate, the general store owner, in exchange for a sack of shriveled potatoes, her only sustenance for the past week. She wore a faded emerald shawl over her charcoal gray dress, the wool fraying at the edges but still carrying the faint scent of lavender from the sachets she'd once made with Daniel. Her hands, once soft and steady, were now chapped and trembling, the cold seeping into her bones as she worked. She hadn't had a customer in days, not since the first snows had blanketed the territory, turning Silver Pines into a ghost town of shuttered windows and whispered fears. The townsfolk were bracing for a blizzard, the kind that could bury a settlement for weeks, and Lillian knew her dwindling stock of herbs wouldn't fetch enough to see her through the worst of it. She'd heard the rumors that the bank was circling, ready to seize her shop over a debt Daniel had taken to buy supplies during the outbreak, a debt she'd only learned of after his death. Lillian's pride was a double-edged sword, as sharp as the apothecary's knife she used to slice roots. She'd once been a respected healer, the woman who'd nursed half of Silver Pines through fevers and frostbite, her knowledge of herbs passed down from her grandmother, a Cherokee medicine, woman who'd taught her the language of plants. But pride wouldn't let her beg, not even when Mrs. Hannah Lowell, the pastor's wife, had slipped a jar of preserves into her hands at Sunday service, her eyes brimming with unspoken pity. "We're here for you, Lillian," Hannah had said, her voice as gentle as a hymn, but Lillian had forced a smile, her spine stiffening as she handed the jar back. "I'll manage," she'd replied, the words a brittle shield against the truth, that she was one storm away from losing everything. As the clock above the counter ticked toward 7:00 p.m., its hands as sluggish as the hope in her chest, Lillian set down her mortar and pestle, her gaze drifting to the locket at her throat. She opened it with a trembling thumb, the pressed violet inside catching the faint light of a single tallow candle on the counter, the last of her stock, its flame a flickering promise against the encroaching dark. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. "I don't know how much longer I can hold on." The words felt like a betrayal, a crack in the armor she'd worn since his death, but they slipped out all the same, carried away by the storm that rattled the shop's thin walls. A heavy thud at the door startled her, the sound sharp and deliberate, cutting through the wail of the blizzard like a gunshot in a quiet meadow. Lillian's pulse quickened, her breath fogging in the frigid air as she crossed the room, her boots scuffing against the warped floorboards. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the latch, fear and curiosity warring in her chest. No one ventured, out in weather like this, not unless they were desperate. Steeling herself, she unlatched the door and pulled it open. A blast of icy wind stinging her cheeks as it swept in, carrying with it the scent of fur and tobacco, and the towering figure of Benjamin Holt. Benjamin Holt was a name that echoed through silver pines like a winter gust, a 45-year-old former soldier turned fur merchant whose wealth in pelts and supplies had made him a cornerstone of the town's survival. Standing at 6'2" with a frame forged by years of battle and hard labor, he was a man who commanded respect, or fear, depending on the day. His chestnut hair, streaked with gray at the temples, was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat dusted with snow, and his deep amber eyes held a storm of their own, sharp and unreadable. A scar ran across his left cheek, a jagged reminder of a skirmish during the Sioux Wars, and his heavy buffalo hide coat made him look more like a bear than a man. 7 years ago, he'd lost his wife, Margaret, to a blizzard much like the one brewing now, and since then, he'd become a solitary figure, his heart as frozen as the Dakota plains. The townsfolk called him Iron Holt, a moniker earned through his unyielding business dealings and his refusal to let anyone close. "Mrs. Ashwood," Benjamin said, his voice a deep, gravelly timbre that seemed to rumble from the earth itself, his breath visible in the icy air. He held a burlap sack in one gloved hand, the faint clink of glass bottles inside hinting at its contents. Supplies, perhaps, or something more. "I've heard whispers of a storm that'll bury this town by morning. And I've heard you're out of more than just firewood. We need to speak. Now." Lillian's fingers tightened on the doorframe, her pride flaring like a spark in dry tinder. But the weight of that sack and the intensity in Benjamin's gaze stirred a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope, mingled with dread. What did Iron Holt want with a healer on the brink of collapse, and what would his help cost her in a town where nothing came without a price? The wind howled outside Ashwood's Remedies, its mournful cry rattling the frost-etched windows of the small apothecary shop, as if the Dakota winter itself were demanding entry. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sage and desperation, the single tallow candle on the counter casting a frail glow that barely reached the corners of the room. Lillian Ashwood stood behind the counter, her hazel eyes narrowing in focus as she crushed dried yarrow in her mortar, her movements mechanical despite the tremor in her hands. She'd barely registered Benjamin Holt's words. "We need to speak now," her mind too clouded by hunger and fatigue to fully grasp the weight of his presence. The towering fur merchant stood just inside the doorway, his buffalo hide coat shedding flecks of snow onto the floorboards, his amber eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. In his gloved hands, the burlap sack clinked softly, a promise of supplies she wasn't sure she could afford to accept. Lillian forced her voice to remain steady, though it wavered like the candle's flame. "Mr. Holt, I appreciate your concern, but I'm managing just fine. If you've come to barter, I can offer a poultice for that scar of yours. It's looking redder than usual in this cold." Her attempt at deflection was as brittle as the ice on the windows, and Benjamin's expression didn't soften. He stepped closer, his boots thudding against the floor with a soldier's precision, and set the sack on the counter with a deliberate thud. "This isn't about bartering, Mrs. Ashwood," he said, his voice a low growl that seemed to rumble from the depths of the earth. "And you're not managing. You're starving yourself to death, and half of Silver Pines knows it. I won't stand by and watch another woman freeze in this godforsaken territory. Not when I can do something about it." Her pride flared, a spark in the darkness of her exhaustion, and she drew herself up to her full height, though the effort made her vision swim. "I don't need your pity, Mr. Holt," she snapped, her tone sharper than she intended. "I've kept this shop running through worse winters than this, and I'll do it again. If you've come to gloat over my debts, you can save your breath. The bank will have its due soon enough." She turned back to her mortar, her fingers gripping the pestle as if it were a lifeline. But the room tilted dangerously, the edges of her sight darkening like a storm cloud rolling in. She hadn't eaten since yesterday's meager potato, and the cold had seeped so deeply into her bones that she could no longer feel her toes. Yet she refused to let Iron Holt see her falter. Not the man who'd once told the town council that a widow had no business running a shop, that she'd bring ruin on herself and everyone else. Benjamin's gaze didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something softer in his amber eyes. Concern, perhaps, or recognition of a pain he'd known too well. "I didn't come to gloat," he said, his voice quieter now, though no less firm. "I came because I've seen what pride can do to a woman in a winter like this. My Margaret thought she could outlast a blizzard, too. She walked 3 miles. To deliver supplies to a neighbor, said she'd be fine. She never made it back. I won't let that happen again, not in my town." He gestured to the sack, his gloved hand steady. "There's bread, dried venison, and a bottle of cider in there, enough to get you through the night. Take it, Mrs. Ashwood, or I'll leave it on your doorstep for the wolves to claim." Lillian's throat tightened, the mention of his late wife catching her off guard. She'd heard the whispers about Margaret Holt, how she'd perished in a storm 7 years ago, how Benjamin had found her frozen body the next morning, her scarf still clutched in her hand. But hearing it from him, raw and unfiltered, stirred something in her chest, a pang of shared grief that threatened to crack the wall she'd built around her heart. She opened her mouth to protest, to insist she didn't need his charity, but a sudden wave of dizziness overtook her, her knees buckling as the mortar slipped from her hands with a dull thud. She would have fallen if Benjamin hadn't moved with the speed of a soldier, his strong arms catching her before she hit the floor, the scent of fur and tobacco enveloping her as he steadied her against his broad chest. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it, his breath warm against her temple. Lillian's hands pressed against his coat, her fingers curling into the coarse hide as she fought to regain her balance, but the locket around her neck slipped, free, its clasp springing open in the struggle. The pressed violet inside caught the candlelight, a fragile burst of color in the dimness, and Benjamin's gaze dropped to it, his expression shifting as if he'd glimpsed a piece of her soul. "Daniel gave me that," she whispered, her voice barely audible, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "It's all I have left of him and our daughter." Her eyes stung with unshed tears, the admission stripping her bare in a way she hadn't expected, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadow of his own pain flicker across his scarred face. Benjamin gently set her down on a wooden stool behind the counter, his hands lingering on her shoulders as if to ensure she wouldn't collapse again. "You can't keep going like this," he said, his tone a mix of frustration and something deeper, something that sounded like fear. He turned to the counter, his eyes scanning the cluttered shelves until they landed on a small, leather-bound ledger tucked beneath a jar of dried chamomile. He pulled it free, flipping it open with a soldier's efficiency, and his jaw tightened as he read the entries, page after page of transactions, most marked in red ink, showing remedies sold at a loss to the townsfolk. Willow bark for Mrs. Lowell's fever, 2 cents. Elderberry syrup for the Tate boy's cough, 1 cent. "You've been giving away more than you're making," he said, his voice low but edged with disbelief. "You're not just broke, Mrs. Ashwood. You're bleeding yourself dry for this town." Lillian's cheeks flushed, a mix of shame and defiance burning through her haze of exhaustion. "They needed those remedies," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I learned healing from my grandmother. She was Cherokee, taught me that a healer's duty is to the people, not the prophet. I won't let children go sick just because their parents can't pay." Her words hung in the air, a testament to her selflessness, but also to the stubborn pride that had brought her to this breaking point. Benjamin closed the ledger with a snap, his amber eyes locking onto hers, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his iron facade, a flicker of admiration tinged with exasperation. "Noble as that is," he said, "it's going to kill you if you don't let someone help, and I'm not leaving this shop until you do." The candle on the counter sputtered, its flame dwindling to a mere ember, casting long shadows across the room as the storm outside grew louder, its roar a harbinger of the blizzard that would soon engulf Silver Pines. Lillian clutched the locket, the pressed violet a fragile reminder of all she'd lost, and met Benjamin's gaze, her pride warring with the undeniable truth of her situation. He'd seen her at her weakest, stripped her defenses bare with a single glance at her ledger. But what would he do with that knowledge? And how far would Iron Holt go to ensure she survived the night? The storm outside Ashwood's Remedies raged with a ferocity that seemed to shake the very foundations of Silver Pines, the wind howling like a chorus of restless spirits as snow battered the apothecary's thin walls. Inside, the air was heavy, with the scent of dried herbs and unspoken grief, the dim glow of the tallow candle on the counter flickering as if it, too, were on the verge of surrender. Lillian Ashwood sat on the wooden stool behind the counter, her slender frame trembling beneath her fraying emerald shawl, her hazel eyes locked on Benjamin Holt as he stood before her, his amber gaze unyielding. The ledger he'd found, its pages a testament to her selflessness and ruin, lay closed on the counter, a silent accusation of her pride. The burlap sack he'd brought rested beside it, its contents a lifeline she couldn't bring herself to accept, even as her stomach growled with a hunger that had become a constant companion. "You can't keep going like this," Benjamin repeated, his voice a deep rumble that cut through the storm's din, his scarred face etched with a mix of frustration and resolve. "I'm not leaving until you let me help, Mrs. Ashwood. You're not just risking your life, you're risking the lives of everyone in Silver Pines who depends on your remedies. If this blizzard buries us, they'll need you more than ever." His words struck her like a lash, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. She thought of little Caleb Tate, the storekeeper's son, whose cough had eased with her elderberry syrup, and Mrs. Lowell, whose fever had broken after a poultice of willow bark. She'd given so much to this town, yet here she sat on the edge of collapse, her pride the only thing keeping her from accepting the help she so desperately needed. Lillian's fingers tightened around the silver locket at her throat, the pressed violet inside a fragile reminder of all she'd lost: Daniel, their unborn daughter, the life they'd dreamed of building in this rugged territory. "I don't take charity," she said, her voice hoarse but defiant, though the tremor in it betrayed her weakness. "I've survived this long on my own, Mr. Holt. I'll find a way through this winter, storm or no storm." But even as she spoke, her vision blurred, the room tilting as hunger gnawed at her insides, a beast she could no longer ignore. Benjamin's jaw clenched, his amber eyes darkening with a storm of his own, and he turned to the sack, untying it with a soldier's efficiency. "This isn't charity," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "It's survival, and if you won't take it for yourself, take it for the folks who'll need you when this blizzard passes." From the sack, he pulled a small iron brazier, its surface blackened from use, along with a bundle of kindling and a few precious logs, luxuries in a town where firewood was as scarce as hope. He knelt by the cold stove in the corner, his movements precise as he arranged the wood, striking a match with a practiced hand. The flame caught quickly, a burst of warmth spreading through the shop, chasing away the chill that had settled into Lillian's bones. Next, he produced a slab of dried buffalo meat, a sack of cornmeal, and a small jar of honey, the golden liquid glinting in the firelight like a promise of sweeter days. "Buffalo meat and cornmeal," he said, setting the items on the counter. "Staples of the Dakota Plains, kept my regiment alive during the Sioux Wars. The honey's from Mrs. Harper's apiary. You need the strength it'll give you." Lillian watched, her pride warring with the undeniable relief that warmth brought to her shivering frame. The scent of burning wood filled the shop, mingling with the faint sweetness of the honey. And for a moment she was transported back to a memory she'd buried deep, a winter evening with Daniel, when they'd sat by their own hearth, sharing a Cherokee ritual her grandmother had taught her. She'd crushed sage and cedar, burning them in a small clay bowl while Daniel watched, his blue eyes bright with curiosity, and they'd whispered prayers for health and renewal, the pressed violet in her locket a symbol of their shared hope. Now, as the brazier's warmth seeped into the room, she felt a pang of longing so sharp it stole her breath, and without thinking, she reached for a small clay jar on the shelf, her hands moving on instinct. "What are you doing?" Benjamin asked, his voice softer now, his eyes following her movements as he stood, brushing soot from his hands. Lillian didn't answer at first, her fingers trembling as she sprinkled a pinch of sage and cedar into the jar, then held it over. the brazier's flame. The herbs smoldered, releasing a fragrant smoke that curled upward like a prayer, and she closed her eyes, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke in Cherokee, the words a melody of healing she hadn't uttered since Daniel's death. "It's a ritual my grandmother taught me," she said finally, her eyes opening to meet Benjamin's. "Sage and cedar to cleanse the spirit, to bring renewal. Daniel and I used to do this together, before the diphtheria took him." The locket at her throat felt heavier now, the pressed violet inside a bridge between past and present, and she saw a flicker of understanding in Benjamin's gaze, a shared recognition of loss that needed no words. He stepped closer, his broad frame casting a shadow over the counter, and for the first time, Lillian saw the weight of his own grief, etched in the lines of his face, the scar on his cheek a stark reminder of battles fought and lost. "I know what it's like to carry a ghost," he said, his voice low, rough with emotion. "Margaret, she died because I wasn't there. I was on a supply run to Fort Pierre, trading furs for provisions during a blizzard I thought we could outlast. She went to check on a neighbor's child, said it was her duty just like you with your remedies. The storm caught her on the way back. I found her the next morning, frozen not a mile from our cabin, her scarf still wrapped around her hands like she'd been trying to keep warm." His voice broke on the last word, and he looked away, his amber eyes glistening with unshed tears, the iron Holt facade cracking under the weight of his regret. Lillian's heart ached, the smoke from the sage and cedar swirling around them like a veil, binding their shared pain in a moment of quiet understanding. She reached out, her hand, trembling as it rested on his arm, the coarse fabric of his coat rough beneath her fingers. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words heavy with the weight of her own loss. "But you're here now, Mr. Holt. That counts for something." Her touch seemed to anchor him, and he met her gaze again, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes before he nodded, his soldier's discipline reasserting itself. He turned to the supplies, slicing the buffalo meat with a small knife from his belt, mixing it with cornmeal and a drizzle of honey to form a crude patty, which he set on a tin plate over the brazier to cook. "Eat," he said, handing her the plate once the patty was done, the aroma of seared meat and honey making her stomach clench with longing. "You can hate me for overstepping, but you'll eat first." Lillian hesitated, her pride still a stubborn flame in her chest, but the warmth of the brazier and the sincerity in Benjamin's eyes wore down her defenses. She took a small bite, the rich, savory taste flooding her senses, and tears pricked her eyes as the nourishment seeped into her starving body, a lifeline she hadn't realized she needed so desperately. "Thank you," she murmured, the words tasting of surrender, her voice softer now, tinged with a vulnerability she couldn't hide. Benjamin watched her eat, his expression unreadable, but there was a tenderness in his silence that spoke louder than words. "I'll make sure you're set for the winter," he said finally, his tone firm but not unkind. "I've got contacts in Fort Pierre, supplies, firewood, whatever you need to keep this shop running. But you'll have to let me help Mrs. Ashwood. No more of this lone wolf nonsense." He paused, then added, "And you should know, the town's talking. Some think I'm helping you just to get my hands on this shop to settle your debt with the bank in my favor. I need you to trust me when I say that's not my intent." Lillian's hand froze mid-bite, her hazel eyes widening. As the weight of his words sank in, the townsfolk's rumors were a storm of their own, one that could destroy her reputation as surely as the blizzard could bury her shop. But as she looked at Benjamin, his scarred face illuminated by the brazier's glow, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart stutter, a flicker of something deeper, something that looked like a promise. Before she could respond, a sharp crack echoed from outside, the sound of a shutter breaking loose in the storm, and Benjamin's head snapped toward the door, his soldier's instincts kicking in. "Stay here," he said, grabbing his coat and heading for the door. "I'll secure the shop, but I'm coming back, and when I do, I've got a plan to keep you safe through this winter, whether you like it or not." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Lillian alone with the crackling brazier, the sage-scented smoke, and the weight of his words. What plan could Iron Holt possibly have for a woman on the edge of ruin? And would her pride survive the storm of trust he was asking her to weather? The blizzard's fury battered Silver Pines with unrelenting force, the snow piling high against the walls of Ashwood's Remedies, as if the Dakota Territory itself sought to bury the small apothecary shop in a shroud of white. Inside, the brazier Benjamin Holt had lit cast a warm golden glow across the room, its crackling flames a stark contrast to the storm's icy howl. Lillian Ashwood sat behind the counter, the tin plate of buffalo meat and cornmeal now empty, the honey's sweetness lingering on her tongue like a memory of better days. Her hazel eyes, still shadowed with exhaustion, watched Benjamin as he re-entered the shop, his buffalo hide coat dusted with fresh snow, his scarred face set with a determination that made her heart stutter. The shutter he'd secured rattled in the wind but held firm, a small victory against the tempest that threatened to engulf them both. "You didn't have to do that," Lillian said, her voice soft but steady, the edge of her pride dulled by the warmth in her belly and the fire's comforting heat. She adjusted her fraying emerald shawl, her fingers brushing the silver locket at her throat, the pressed violet inside a quiet reminder of the life she'd lost. Benjamin shook the snow from his hat, his amber eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made the small shop feel even smaller. "I did," he replied, his voice a low rumble, steady as the beat of a war drum. "And I'm not done. You can't stay here alone through this storm, Mrs. Ashwood. Not with the bank circling and the town whispering. I've got a plan to keep you safe through the winter, but you'll need to hear me out." Lillian's spine stiffened, her instincts urging her to resist, to cling to the independence that had kept her afloat since Daniel's death. But the memory of her collapse, of Benjamin's strong arms catching her, and the ledger that laid bare her sacrifices tempered her defiance. "I'm listening," she said, her tone cautious but not unkind, her fingers tightening around the locket as if it could anchor her against whatever he was about to propose. Benjamin nodded, pulling a small roll of birch bark from inside his coat. A piece of frontier stationery, its surface smooth and pale, etched with the faint grain of the tree it had come from. "I run a fur trading outpost on the outskirts of Silver Pines," he began, unrolling the bark on the counter, his gloved hands steady despite the chill. "My workers, trappers, skinners, families, they need remedies year-round. Fevers, frostbite, cuts from the trade. They've been buying tonics from Fort Pierre, but your skills are better. I want you to be our apothecary, Mrs. Ashwood. You'll supply remedies for my people, and in return I'll cover your debt to the bank. Keep this shop in your name where it belongs." The words hung in the air like the sage smoke from her earlier ritual, a mix of promise and peril that made Lillian's breath catch. It was a lifeline, a way to save her shop without surrendering her dignity. But it came with strings. She'd be tied to Benjamin Holt, a man whose reputation as Iron Holt made her wary, even as his actions tonight had shown a softer side. "And what's in it for you?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of hope. "The town already thinks you're after my shop. How do I know this isn't a way to control me, to take what's mine, when I'm too weak to fight back?" Benjamin's jaw tightened, but his gaze didn't waver, and for a moment she saw a flash of hurt in his amber eyes, quickly masked by his soldier's discipline. "I don't want your shop," he said, his voice low but fierce. "I want you, alive. My workers need a healer, and Silver Pines needs you, not just your remedies, but your spirit. I've seen what you do for this town, even when it cost you everything. I'm offering a partnership, not a takeover." Lillian studied him, searching for a lie in his weathered face, but found only sincerity, a rare thing in a man who'd built his fortune on hard bargains and harder winters. She thought of her grandmother's teachings, the Cherokee belief that healing was a communal act, a circle of care that bound a people together. This arrangement could keep her shop open, could let her continue that legacy, but only if she could trust him. "If I agree," she said slowly, her voice measured, "I have conditions. I keep control of my recipes. My grandmother's knowledge isn't for sale, and this shop stays a sanctuary for the townsfolk. not just your workers. They'll always have a place here no matter what. Benjamin nodded, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips, the first she'd seen since he'd walked through her door. Done, he said, pulling a small quill and a vial of ink from his coat. Anything else? She hesitated, then added, and I want your word. No interference in how I run things. I'm not one of your soldiers to command, Mr. Holt. His smile widened, a rare warmth softening the scar on his cheek, and he dipped the quill in ink, scrawling their agreement on the birch bark in his bold, deliberate hand. You've got my word, he said, signing his name at the bottom, then sliding the bark toward her. Your turn. Lillian took the quill, her hand steady despite the storm raging outside, and added her signature beneath his, the ink dark against the pale bark, a pact forged in firelight, as binding as the winter that surrounded them. The next morning, the storm had eased to a deceptive calm, the snowdrifts piled high but the sky a brittle blue, as if the Dakota Territory were catching its breath before the next onslaught. Lillian stood at the edge of Benjamin's fur-trading outpost, a rugged compound of log cabins and tanning racks just a mile from Silver Pines, the air sharp with the scent of pine and smoked pelts. Her shop was secure for now, the bank debt, covered by Benjamin's funds, and she'd packed a small satchel of remedies, salves, tinctures, and dried herbs, to begin her work. Benjamin walked beside her, his tall frame a steady presence as he introduced her to his workers. A mix of Sioux trappers, Irish laborers, and their families, their faces weathered but welcoming, their voices a blend of languages that echoed the frontier's diversity. This is Mrs. Ashwood, Benjamin announced, his voice carrying over the bustle of the outpost, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. She'll be our healer, from now on. Any ailment you come to her. A Sioux woman named Dakota, her dark eyes bright with curiosity, stepped forward, holding a small boy with a bandaged hand. Frostbite? She asked in halting English, and Lillian nodded, kneeling to examine the child's fingers with a gentleness that belied her own exhaustion. I've got a salve for that, she said, pulling a tin of pine resin and comfrey from her satchel, her hand steady as she applied it, the boy's shy smile a small reward that warmed her heart. As she worked, Lillian felt the weight of the locket at her throat lighten, the pressed violet inside no longer a stone of grief but a seed of something new. Hope, perhaps, or the beginnings of healing. She glanced at Benjamin, who was speaking with an Irish trapper named Declan, his deep laugh surprising her with its warmth, a side of Iron Holt she hadn't expected to see. The workers respected him, she realized, not just out of fear, but because he'd earned it, through fair dealings, through the supplies he brought from Fort Pierre, through the way he'd kept them alive in winters past. Maybe, just maybe, she could trust him too. But the calm was short-lived. As Lillian finished bandaging the boy's hand, a shout rang out from the edge of the outpost, sharp and urgent, cutting through the crisp morning air. "Holt, we've got trouble," Declan called, pointing toward the tree line, where a group of riders approached, their silhouettes dark against the snow, rifles glinting in the pale sunlight. Benjamin's hand went to the knife at his belt, his soldier's instincts kicking in, and he turned to Lillian, his amber eyes flashing with a warning she couldn't ignore. "Stay close," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Those aren't trappers, and they're not here to trade. Who were these armed riders, and what danger had they brought to the outpost on the heels of the storm?" The morning sun cast a pale, frigid light over Benjamin Holt's fur-trading outpost, its rays glinting off the fresh snow that blanketed the Dakota Territory in the wake of the blizzard. But the calm was a cruel illusion, shattered by the thunder of hoofbeats as a group of armed riders charged toward the outpost, their rifles gleaming with menace. Lillian Ashwood stood near a tanning rack, her satchel of remedies slung over her shoulder, her hazel eyes wide with alarm as the shout of danger echoed through the compound. Benjamin was at her side in an instant, his hand on the knife at his belt, his amber eyes narrowing as he assessed the threat. "Stay close," he'd warned. But now, as the riders drew nearer, his voice turned sharp with command. "Get to the supply shed. Now." Lillian's heart pounded, her fingers clutching the silver locket at her throat, the pressed violet inside a fragile anchor as chaos erupted around her. The riders, 5 men in tattered coats, their faces obscured by scarves, were no ordinary trappers. They were the Blackthorn Gang, a notorious band of outlaws who'd plagued the Dakota Territory since the railroads pushed west, preying on frontier outposts in the aftermath of storms when defenses were down. Benjamin recognized them instantly, his soldier's instincts kicking in as he shouted orders to his workers. "Declan, Dakota, grab the rifles, barricade the main gate." The Sioux woman, Dakota, and the Irish trapper, Declan, moved with practiced speed, rallying the others as children were ushered into cabins, their cries swallowed by the wind. Lillian hesitated, her healer's instinct urging her to stay and help. But Benjamin's hand gripped her arm, his touch firm yet protective. "You're no good to anyone dead," he growled, his scarred face taut with urgency. He pushed her toward the supply shed, a sturdy log structure at the edge of the outpost, and shoved her inside, slamming the door behind her. "Stay put," he ordered through the wood, his voice muffled but resolute before his footsteps faded into the fray. Lillian pressed her back against the door, her breath fogging in the dim, cold space, the scent of smoked pelts and pine resin heavy in the air. Through a crack in the wall, she watched as Benjamin took charge, his broad frame a beacon of strength amid the chaos, directing his workers with the precision of a man who'd once led soldiers into battle. The Blackthorn Gang dismounted, their leader, a wiry man with a crooked nose, barking orders as they fired warning shots into the air, the cracks echoing like thunder across the snowy expanse. "Hand over the pelts, Holt, and we'll let you live," the leader shouted, his voice dripping with malice. Benjamin stood his ground, a rifle now in his hands, his amber eyes blazing with defiance. "You'll have to take them over my dead body," he shot back, his voice steady as iron, and with a sharp whistle he signaled his workers to fire. The outpost erupted into a battlefield, bullets whizzing through the air as Benjamin and his men fought back, their makeshift barricades holding against the onslaught. Lillian's hands trembled as she clutched her locket, the pressed violet a silent prayer for safety, her mind racing with fear for Benjamin and the workers she'd just begun to know. Through the crack, she saw Dakota take down one of the outlaws with a well-aimed shot, her face fierce with determination, while Declan wrestled another to the ground, his Irish curses ringing out. Benjamin moved like a man possessed, his military training evident in every calculated step, his rifle firing with deadly accuracy. But the leader of the gang turned his gaze toward the supply shed, his crooked nose twitching as if he'd scented something valuable, and Lillian's blood ran cold. They weren't just after pelts. They were looking for something else, something hidden in the outpost that Benjamin hadn't mentioned. A bullet splintered the wood near her head, and Lillian dropped to the floor, her heart hammering as the door shuddered under a heavy blow. Benjamin's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and desperate. "Lillian, stay down," he shouted, and she heard the crunch of snow as he charged toward the shed, his rifle barking as he took down the outlaw, trying to break in. The man fell with a grunt, but not before his leader shouted a chilling command. "Find the strongbox, it's got to be here somewhere." What strongbox, and what secret was Benjamin keeping that had brought these outlaws to his door? The aftermath of the Blackthorn Gang's attack left Benjamin Holt's fur-trading outpost in a state of uneasy quiet. The snow around the compound stained with the remnants of battle, splinters of wood, a few bloodied patches, and the echoes of gunfire that still lingered in the crisp Dakota air. Lillian Ashwood stood outside the supply shed, her emerald shawl wrapped tightly around her, her hazel eyes scanning the outpost as Benjamin and his workers secured the perimeter, their faces grim but relieved. The outlaws had fled after a fierce fight, driven off by Benjamin's military precision and the loyalty of his diverse crew, Sioux trappers and Irish laborers who'd fought as one. But the victory came at a cost. Whispers from Silver Pines had already begun to spread, carried on the wind like the storm that had just passed. Lillian overheard the murmurs when Dakota's husband, a Sioux trapper named Kanji, returned from town with news. "They're saying Holt kept you here overnight to control you," Kanji said, his voice low, his dark eyes apologetic. Some think he's using you to take over your shop. Others say worse, that a widow shouldn't be alone with a man like him. Lillian's heart sank, her fingers clutching the silver locket at her throat, the pressed violet inside a silent reminder of her fragile place in this frontier world. As a healer, her shop depended on the town's trust. Rumors like these could ruin her, turning her sanctuary into a place of suspicion and shame. Benjamin approached, his buffalo hide coat still flecked with snow, his scarred face set with a determination that made her pulse quicken. "We need to talk," he said, his amber eyes searching hers, a flicker of concern breaking through his iron Holt facade. "Those rumors, they'll destroy you if we don't act. I've seen what gossip can do to a woman's reputation out here, especially a widow. There's a way to stop it, but you won't like it." Lillian braced herself, sensing the weight of what was coming, her pride already stirring in protest. "What way?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. Benjamin's jaw tightened, but his gaze didn't waver. "Marry me," he said, the words blunt but laced with an urgency that caught her off guard. "A marriage. Of convenience, nothing more. It'll protect your name, give you a proper reason to be here to work with me. The town will talk, but they'll talk about a wedding, not a scandal." Lillian's breath hitched, the idea as jarring as the gunfire that had shattered the morning. Marriage. To Iron Holt? The man who'd saved her life, yes, but also a man whose hard exterior made her wary, even as his actions spoke of a deeper kindness. "And what about my work?" she countered, her voice sharp with defiance. "I won't be controlled, Mr. Holt. Not by you, not by anyone. If I agree, I keep my role at the outpost, and my shop stays my own. And my Cherokee traditions. You don't interfere with my rituals, ever." A flicker of respect flashed in Benjamin's eyes, and he nodded, his voice softening. "Agreed. You'll have your independence, Mrs. Ashwood. I'm not asking for your heart, just your hand to keep you safe." The sincerity in his tone disarmed her, and after a long moment, she gave a reluctant nod, the weight of necessity pressing down on her pride. That evening, in a small clearing at the outpost, they stood before Kanji's father, a Sioux elder named Wikasa, who'd agreed to officiate in a simple ceremony blending frontier practicality with Sioux tradition. Wikasa draped a woven blanket over their shoulders, a symbol of unity, his weathered hands steady as he spoke words of binding in his native tongue, the firelight casting shadows on the snow. Lillian felt the weight of the moment, her gray dress, a stark contrast to the blanket's vibrant colors, her locket glinting in the firelight. Benjamin stood beside her, his broad frame tense, and as Wikasa bound their hands with a leather cord, she noticed a ring on his finger, a simple silver band, etched with a faint pattern of leaves. "It was Margaret's," he murmured, catching her gaze, his voice thick with emotion. "I haven't worn it since she passed, thought it was time." The vulnerability in his words mirrored her own, the pressed violet in her locket a twin to his grief. And for the first time, Lillian felt a spark of something real, a connection forged not just by necessity, but by shared loss. The ceremony ended with a nod from Wikasa, and the workers clapped, their cheers a quiet defiance against the town's rumors. But as Lillian and Benjamin stepped away from the fire, Declan approached, his face pale. "Holt, one of the outlaws we captured. He's talking. Says they were after a strongbox with your army papers. Something about a map to a gold claim you found during the Sioux Wars." Benjamin's expression darkened, a storm brewing in his amber eyes, and Lillian's heart raced. What secret from his past had brought this danger to their doorstep? The blizzard returned to the Dakota Territory with a vengeance, its icy winds howling through the pines around Benjamin Holt's fur-trading outpost, blanketing silver pines in a relentless shroud of white. Inside the main cabin, the air was thick with the scent of burning pine and the murmur of huddled voices as workers' families, Sioux, Irish and frontier-born, sought shelter from the storm's wrath. Lillian Ashwood sat near the hearth, her emerald shawl draped over her shoulders, her hazel eyes reflecting the firelight as she stirred a pot of herbal tea. its steam rising like a prayer for warmth. The outpost had become a sanctuary, with children curled in blankets and adults sharing quiet stories, their faces etched with the resilience of those who'd survived Dakota winters before. Benjamin stood by the door, his broad frame silhouetted against the frost-etched window, his amber eyes scanning the swirling snow for any sign of the Blackthorn gang's return. The captured outlaw's words about the strongbox, a map to a gold claim from his army days, had left a shadow over him, one Lillian could sense even from across the room. She'd seen the tension in his scarred face, the way his hand lingered on Margaret's ring, now paired with the simple leather cord from their wedding. As the storm's howl grew louder, he turned to her, his gaze softening, and crossed the cabin to sit beside her, the fire casting a warm glow over his weathered features. "We're in for a long night," he said, his voice low, meant for her, alone amidst the hum of the crowded cabin. "But you're safe here, Lillian, I'll make sure of it." The use of her first name, a quiet intimacy since their wedding, sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She handed him a tin mug of tea, her fingers brushing his, and the contact sparked a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt since Daniel's laughter filled her days. "I know," she replied, her voice soft, her hazel eyes meeting his with a vulnerability she could no longer hide. The storm had trapped them together, and in its ferocity, she felt the walls around her heart begin to crack. "But that strongbox, when it's weighing on you, what does it mean, Benjamin?" Her question hung between them, delicate as the snowflakes outside, and for a moment, she thought he'd retreat behind his iron Holt mask. Instead, he sighed, his gaze dropping to the ring on his finger, his voice raw with emotion. "The map in that strongbox, it was for Margaret," he confessed, his words heavy with guilt. "I found a gold claim during the Sioux Wars, a vein in the Black Hills. I promised her we'd use it to start over, build a life away from these winters, but I was too late. She died before I could make it real. Now, I'm afraid. Afraid? I'll fail you too, just when I'm starting to—" He stopped, his amber eyes lifting to hers, and the unspoken words hung in the air like a confession. "I'm falling for you, Lillian. Against all my better judgment, I am." Her breath caught the weight of his admission, stirring something deep within her, a thawing, a blooming like the pressed violet in her locket. She touched the locket now, her fingers trembling, and shared a piece of her own heart. "My grandmother told me a Cherokee story," she said, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "About a flower that blooms through the frost, a sign of renewal after the harshest winter. I thought I'd never feel that again after Daniel, but you're making me believe I can." The firelight danced in her eyes, and in a moment of quiet courage she leaned forward, her lips brushing his in a kiss as tender as spring rain, the warmth of it a promise amidst the blizzard's chill. They pulled back, breathless, the sleeping families around them a silent witness to the shift between them, but as the fire crackled, a sharp thud echoed from the roof, followed by the groan of splitting wood. A beam, weakened by the storm, giving way under the snow's weight. Benjamin's eyes widened, his soldier's instincts flaring, and he grabbed her hand, his voice urgent. "We need to move now." What new danger had the blizzard unleashed, and would it unearth the secrets of the strongbox before they could face them together? The blizzard's wrath unleashed chaos on Benjamin Holt's fur-trading outpost. The collapsing beam on the main cabin's roof, sending a shower of snow and splintered wood crashing down as the storm raged on. Lillian Ashwood scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding, her emerald shawl slipping as she helped Benjamin usher the workers' families to safety in a smaller cabin nearby. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and fear, but Benjamin's steady hand on her arm anchored her, his amber eyes fierce with determination. "We're not losing anyone tonight," he vowed, his voice cutting through the storms. Howl, and together, they ensured every child, every worker was safe, the firelight from the new shelter casting a warm glow over their weary faces. As the storm subsided to a mournful whisper, Benjamin led Lillian to a locked chest in the corner of the cabin, the strongbox the Blackthorn gang had been after. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing a faded map to a gold claim in the Black Hills, alongside a letter in his bold script, addressed to Margaret. "I wrote this before she died," he said, his voice raw with emotion, handing it to Lillian. "I promised her we'd use the gold to build a community apothecary, a place of healing for anyone who needed it. I never got the chance. But when I saw you, Lillian, I knew I had to try again." Her hazel eyes widened as, he pulled a second document from the chest, a deed, stamped by the bank, transferring ownership of her shop fully to her name. "I didn't just pay your debt," he admitted, his gaze steady. "I bought the whole property outright to keep the gang from coming after you. That gold claim, they'd kill for it. I couldn't let them take you too." Lillian's breath caught, the weight of his sacrifice sinking in, her fingers clutching the silver locket at her throat, the pressed violet inside a symbol of renewal she now felt blooming in her heart. "You did this honor for me?" she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes, and Benjamin nodded, his scarred face softening with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "For you, for Margaret's dream, for us," he said, his voice breaking with hope. She stepped closer, her hand resting on his, and in that moment, the last of her walls crumbled, their shared grief forging a love stronger than the storm that had tried to break them. Spring arrived in Silver Pines with a gentle thaw, the Dakota plains blooming with wildflowers as the town gathered for a celebration unlike any before, the opening of a new community apothecary, built with the gold Benjamin had claimed from the Black Hills. The wooden structure stood proud on the edge of town, its sign, Ashwood Holt Remedies, painted in vibrant colors, a testament to healing and unity. Lillian stood at the entrance, her gray dress replaced by a new one in soft blue, her raven black hair woven with violets in a nod to her Cherokee heritage. Benjamin was by her side, his buffalo hide coat traded for a simple vest, Margaret's ring gleaming on his finger, a bridge between past and present. As the townsfolk gathered, Dakota and Kangi with their children, Declan and his Irish kin, even the skeptical Mrs. Lowell, Benjamin wrapped an arm around Lillian, pulling her close in full view of the crowd, his embrace silencing the last of the rumors that had once threatened her. "This apothecary belongs to all of us," he announced, his voice steady, "but it's led by the strongest woman I know, my wife, Lillian Holt." The crowd cheered, their applause a melody of acceptance, and Lillian's smile shone brighter than the spring sun, her heart full as she looked at the man who'd thawed her frozen soul. The apothecary wasn't just a place for remedies. It was a cornerstone of frontier life, a hub where the sick were healed, stories were shared, and communities like Silver Pines found strength in unity, a vital role in the American West of the 1880s that ensured survival through harsh winters and beyond. As the celebration faded into laughter and shared meals, Lillian and Benjamin stood together, watching children play among the wildflowers, their future as bright as the violets blooming around them. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kangi approached, his face grave. "Holt, word from Fort Pierre, some of the Blackthorn gang escaped. They're coming for that gold." What new trials awaited the Holts, and would their love withstand the shadows of Benjamin's past? If this story of love and redemption touched your heart, smash that like button and share your favorite moment in the comments below. Don't forget to follow for more historical romance tales that bloom through the frost. Your support keeps these stories alive.